Hello and welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Liz Cavell, Deputy Legal Director at the Freedom from Religion Foundation.
And I'm Chris Line, Rapid Legal Counsel at FFRF.
This week, we are reflecting on the harmful legacy after James Dobson, the founder of Focus on the Family, who used religion to push Christian nationalism and abuse children, died a couple weeks ago at the age of 89.
Yeah, in just a moment, we're going to be joined by Sarah Jones, a senior writer at New York Magazine, who started writing an obituary for James Dobson when she was just 10 years old. Her article, James Dobson Was My Horror and Yours, describes Dobson's harmful influence on her childhood and how his abusive teachings impact American culture to this day.
Thank you for joining us, Sarah. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Who was James Dobson? Can you just explain why was he such an influential figure in American evangelicalism?
James Dobson, his origin story is essentially that he came from a long line of ministers in the Church of the Nazarene, did not feel a call to be a pastor himself, and entered psychology, and achieved some real professional success in the field of child psychology, and was working at the University of Southern California. But Dobson retained the religious beliefs of his youth and was horrified by the sexual revolution and the idea of women's liberation. And so around 1970, he published his first book, Dare to Discipline, which he also viewed as a response to the permissive parenting, as he put it, of Dr. Benjamin Spock, which was very popular at the time. And Dare to Discipline promoted corporal punishment, among other things, to just sort of enforce, so-called traditional family values in the home. That wasn't like a mainstream success, but it was popular with the evangelicals. And from there, he kind of took off, and he founded Focus on the Family eventually, which is what I think he is probably best known for outside the world of evangelicalism. Eventually got involved in electoral and partisan politics more and more as he aged, particularly for anti-LGBT, anti-abortion causes. So that's the short version. I'm happy to elaborate on his activities.
Yeah, so how did Dobson and Focus on the Family help lay the groundwork for today's Christian nationalist movement? You talk about that a little bit in your piece.
Because he was a psychologist, he had a doctorate. That was actually really key to his early work. And he was very good at sort of building a relationship, or what felt like a relationship, with evangelical Christians, many of them wives and mothers, who would go to Focus on the Family for parenting advice. So he had, through Focus on the Family, he had all these radio broadcasts, he was publishing all these books, but I think what made him eventually so influential was the fact that, people could write in to Focus on the Family. And although, my understanding is that he was not writing back to them personally, staff members would, pull excerpts from his books or write back to them. And I think it really there was a consumer relationship there, and I think also what we would maybe now call a parasocial relationship. And I think that was really key to his growing influence, and it kind of sets him apart from perhaps better known figures like Jerry Falwell, who was a pastor. That was not really what James Dobson considered his ministry to be. It was very much like, if you follow my advice, you're going to have a happy, healthy, very Christian family, and everyone's going to, everything's going to work out. And that is, what millions of people wanted to hear. So while you had Christian nationalists, as we would call them now, working more kind of overtly on legislation or getting politicians elected, he was very much focused on transforming the American home as a way to eventually transform American society.
Tell us a little bit more, Sarah, about what values Dobson promoted. I know this was really personal to you. Your parents, I guess, were followers of Dobson's child rearing advice.
He was promoting corporal punishment, but he would promote it in this very ritualized way. And he thought you could should strive to break a child's will without breaking their spirit. If you're spanking a child, whether that's with a hand or a switch, you should immediately tell a child, I love you, I'm just doing this for your own good. And in my view, I think some Christian parents kind of saw in that permission to exceed even the parameters that Dobson set out. I saw on Instagram, for example, someone was talking about, her mom began following Dobson and started beating her children with a riding crop, which is not in any of Dobson's books. But the point was, corporal punishment was good for a child, spare the rod, spoil a child. And, people would take that in the directions they took it. And so in my case, I do think it was really excessive. The idea that you're not supposed to spank your children in anger maybe sounds nice on paper, but that's not really how it worked out for me or for a lot of other people. And because Dobson was also a proponent of like homeschooling and traditional gender roles, there was really no escape. I could maybe go to somebody at my church, but frankly, I didn't trust anybody at my church either, even when I was still a Christian. So it was very much this feeling of like, well, there's just no way out from any of that. And you do start to think, well, maybe there is something wrong with me. Maybe I deserve to be hit in this way. Maybe I deserve to be pushed or shoved or yelled at. And when you kind of combine that with religious messages about, you were born with a sin nature, and God had to send his perfect son to die for you, and you didn't really deserve that. Wasn't it nice of him? It's not great psychologically. That's how I would put it.
You talked about this in your article. I want you to expound on it a little bit. Talk about some of the other like disturbing beliefs and family dynamics that Dobson encouraged and, proselytized, and also like why you think violence was such a big component in his ideology.
If I had to distill kind of the obsessions of James Dobson into like a single idea, it would be gender traditionalism, which I do write about in the article. He was horrified by the sexual revolution. And if you read even his early parenting books, like it's very much about what evangelicals would call complementary gender roles, which is the idea that the man is the leader of the household, the woman lovingly submits to him, and there's this hierarchy in the home, which, just so happens to line up with a gender hierarchy that they would like to enforce outside the home. And that was very key to Dobson's whole worldview. And also his just really, it's hard to overstate his hostility and really hatred for LGBT people. So this was also about, if you parent your Christian children in the right way, not only will they remain Christian, but they will not be LGBT. So it was really saturated in just this obsession with, frankly, sex and gender that he carried with him, his entire life. And so, he had this book that I wrote about it in the article called The Strong-Willed Child. And, as a little girl, I was... it wasn't just that I was disobeying my parents. I think it was also I was not behaving in the way that little girls are supposed to behave by being so argumentative. And, I can happily go into more detail there, but I do think it was just really this overarching fixation and an obsession with gender roles and, frankly, with sex.
As you say in your piece, you started writing a eulogy for Dobson when you were 10 years old, and you'd set up a Google alert for when he died. How did you first, in your personal life, like how did you first come to encounter his ideas, and like what was that? Obviously it wasn't a good impact. What was the impact of that on you growing up, like your personal experience with this?
Right. I grew up with Dobson. It wasn't even just the parenting books. We listened to his radio show all the time. I didn't mention this in the piece, but we didn't really have TV for years, and that I'm fine with. What I'm less fine with is, the alternative was weirdly NPR or James Dobson. But, it was just this constant drumbeat of my childhood, as it was for many, many evangelical children. Sometimes it was funny, like when Adventures in Odyssey did its Dungeons and Dragons episode. Often it was not. And, as a kid, if you're growing up in that world, I think what would be considered abuse in most any other situation does not always register as abuse. But in my case, there is this kind of feeling of being torn, like maybe I deserve it, but also this doesn't feel right. And that feeling that something isn't quite right is actually, in my experience anyway, very hard to get rid of. It just gets louder and louder and louder and louder until you can't ignore it anymore. And as I was a teenager, and, I did eventually end up in public school, and, I was trying to read and educate myself, which was difficult, but learning about feminism, learning about, the idea of women's liberation, and, maybe LGBT people are not going to hell. And, it was this very, very gradual process, but it did start to erode the older I got. And I went to an evangelical college, partly because I thought my parents would be happy. And a couple years into that, I was done. I was not in a position to sort of be open about that, which is again very common for people in that situation. But I just didn't hold those beliefs anymore, and I was just biding my time until I could get out and not go to church anymore.
Let's talk a little bit about how Dobson's teaching and his philosophy, and then his focus on the family initiative, how did all of that impact American Christianity? You talk a lot about sort of the arc of James Dobson and the religious right and the focus on the family era, and that's Reagan times and leading into sort of today's political moment and what the evangelical right looks like in American culture today. Talk about how you view Dobson as influencing what American evangelicalism is today.
Dobson is interesting because he's not really an original thinker. He's not coming up with new ideas. What I think his contribution is to codify what evangelicals already believe. And even though evangelicals, as many people have written about, are, a little skeptical, hostile even to secular credentials, the fact that he did have a doctorate in child psychology was really important because it gave this veneer of authenticity to everything he was saying. So it was he was always Dr. James Dobson. Mm-hmm. That was very important. And so I think that allowed him to sort of go under the radar as far as kind of the rest of the country was concerned, but it is kind of why he became so important to the Christian right in particular. So essentially, he's codifying what evangelicals believe, telling them you're right to believe this, not just because of the Bible, but also because of social science. Not true, but that's what he said. And that was really attractive to people. But also, my theory is that this also helped draw people into that particular brand of Christianity. If you, because he was offering this kind of guidebook to having a good healthy family, and I think that was really attractive to a lot of people. And through the 90s, he really sort of hones in on anti-LGBT activism and political work and promoting conversion therapy, and that really takes off in the 90s. And so by the time he's getting fairly elderly around the 2000s, the work has, in my view, kind of already been done. So he has this juggernaut. He has focus on the family. He helped co-found the Family Research Council. He was one of the figures behind the Arlington Group. And there were all these family policy councils at the state level. So he had this machine that was no longer just about sort of influencing American families, but really influencing the trajectory of American politics. And so by the time Donald Trump in 2015, he announces he's running. And then in 2016, when it becomes clear that, Ted Cruz really is not the evangelical candidate, it's Donald Trump, Dobson comes around and, is very much, if you want to use an evangelical term, very much born again. He becomes, very pro-Trump and sees in Trump this figure who, is perhaps brutal enough, perhaps enough of a strong patriarchal figure, as Dobson would see it, to sort of, get rid of Roe v. Wade and usher in a new era in American politics that Dobson by then had been working for since the 60s, frankly. It was the culmination of a life's work. And so I don't think you really get Christian nationalism as we see it and experience it today without the work of James Dobson. I think he was absolutely part of that. And you can see that everywhere. Roe v. Wade is no longer with us. Dobson was an anti-pornography crusader. We're seeing, attacks on, access to porn. It's everywhere. And while that cannot be laid entirely at his door, but he was very important to that.
Yeah, as you kind of said in your piece, you wrote, there's arguably no path to Trump without Dobson. You also said, Dobson lived just long enough to see his work bear hideous fruit, which I assume is also an allusion kind of to that. But what specifically did you mean by that?
It's strange. I left the church basically as soon as I essentially could when I was done with college, and I thought I was going to make a clean break, and I quickly realized that wasn't going to be possible because the heartbeat bills were taking off, and there were all these attacks on abortion access, and then I started working for Americans United for Separation of Church and State, which kind of was this introduction to kind of where the Christian right was at right now. So I learned a lot about school vouchers, and it just kept getting worse and worse over time. And so by the time Dobson died and I was writing this piece, I see his influence in a number of ways, and we can see it in abortion restrictions. We can see it on national conservatism. This right wing conference is going on right now, and they have a panel on overthrowing Obergefell. So like you can see his influence and attacks on LGBT rights and on trans people in particular, on pornography, his support for homeschooling as an alternative to secular public schooling. Homeschooling is on the rise, and obviously not everyone who homeschools is going to be in the Christian right, but based on the data I've seen, most people who homeschool are still in that world. And so, those are the main things that I was thinking about, but it's multifaceted. And I think sometimes it can be a little bit subtle when you're thinking about, for example, the notion of parental rights. That was a big deal for Dobson, and the way he defines it is perhaps not necessarily the way a secular family would think of it or define it, but it's very much about that hierarchy in the home.
You kind of see everything old, new again in terms of like how Dobson was able to kind of bridge that divide between like culture and religion, right? Like, I think part of what you're describing in terms of like your own experience in your home and other families you knew and Dobson's like entree into your families is like he's entering into this space that is cultural. It's parenting and it's like family dynamics, and it's just like reminds me of kind of like today's, kind of trad, you're trying to like, it almost is like, it's very Maha like you see that crossroads of like culture and religion. And it's not really necessarily about the religion, but it's just, it's a way of kind of like grabbing people whose primary concern is like their family and family dynamics and looking for solutions or different ways to live and parent, and sort of stepping in and saying like, I have the answers, and, they're this anti-mainstream thing, and I can really sell that to you. And so I'm just like curious how you think about those parallels in terms of like what is the heir to like James Dobson, or who do you see as like the parallel figures in today's religious right and also like cultural right?
That's a great question. And when he died, it was something I was thinking about as well. Like, who is the next James Dobson, and or is there one? And the more I thought about it, I kind of came down on the position that he was so influential that I don't know that there could be a single heir, if that makes sense. Like, there are so many people who are sort of operating within the same tradition, with the same ideas and similar tactics and the kind of the same emphasis, not just on gender traditionalism, but kind of the, I don't know how to put it, the absolute authority of the parent and over not just the child, but like in opposition to like a teacher at school or to legislators, and we see it in the Maha movement, even when it comes to, sort of parental objections to vaccination or what have you. So I think he has many, many heirs. And when I'm thinking of people who sort of represent a threat to, what I see is pluralism, democracy, and equality. I think of somebody like Douglas Wilson, who is the pastor and founder of Christ Church in Idaho. And there's been some good coverage of him recently. He was on my radar as far back as college, which was a while ago, like 20 years ago. But, he's become more and more influential over time. And of course, Pete Hegseth, goes to a church that, is in the association founded by Wilson. And, he doesn't think women should have the right to vote, which is way further than Dobson went even. So I think you can think of Dobson as like somebody who whether he always intended to or not, he created a world where it was very easy for somebody like Wilson to sort of eventually achieve the prominence that Wilson now has and the influence that Wilson now has, and is, they're taking it in directions that I don't know that even Dobson as an individual necessarily understood that they would go, but that is what's happening.
Your piece was one of the few good pieces of that I read where it was like expressing a negative view and kind of really openly talking about the problems with Dobson. A lot of, even in the mainstream press, obviously the right Christian groups were like celebrating his life and how awesome he was and how much he did. But like even mainstream press wasn't really nailing, kind of expressing these things that you express in your piece. So what do you think the mainstream press, misses when it covers Dobson and leaders like him? Like, you're a journalist, like what is it that the mainstream is missing? And then obviously we're seeing that now too with Doug Wilson. I mean, he's in the news all the time, but it's not necessarily being covered in the alarming way you might hope. It's more just like curious, like, oh, look at this man who thinks women shouldn't be able to vote and has this growing church and influence and everything. And so he's in the news.
Success. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
When I got my first full-time in journalism really about 6 weeks before Donald Trump won the election in 2016, which is great timing. But I remember being struck by the fact that I was surrounded by very well-educated, very intelligent people who were often, I would say, good journalists, but there was just this whole other America out there that they really didn't seem to know anything about. Like, I was a bit of an oddity for a number of reasons, but that was kind of one of them. And so I think a lot of people didn't know who James Dobson was or realize who influential he was. And that was true for Doug Wilson, who's been, frankly, influential for a very, very long time. But that really went under the radar as far as the mainstream press was concerned. Or if you saw anything about it, it would be kind of like on Religion News Service, like a specialty wire. It wouldn't be always in the New York Times or I work in magazines. It definitely wasn't in magazines. But, and it's kind of considered gauche and, do people really believe that? But of course, millions upon millions of people do. And then I see this tendency where it's like, well, in the name of objectivity, we're just going to, maybe detail what they believe, but perhaps, I would say, perhaps not in a way that is very good at sort of capturing, how threatening it actually is. So how informative is it really? And I'm a bit lucky because I do work for a magazine. I don't work for the New York Times or NPR, so I can have an opinion, and it allows me a little bit more flexibility when I'm writing about somebody like Dobson, and which I think is important. I think you can be fair and accurate without necessarily doing the whole both sides thing. So it's a number of factors, but those are the two that I would single out. I think that there's a class element where the people who are really successful in journalism did not go to these colleges. They went to Harvard, they went to Yale, they didn't go to my alma mater. But also just like this specific reporting style that I think makes it really difficult to sort of capture the political project of the Christian right. And I've found that very frustrating over the years. I think it's better than it was. But it is a little like, oh, you're just hearing of Douglas Wilson because of a CNN segment. Let me tell you all the lore about Douglas Wilson. But hopefully it's not too late for some better reporting on that front.
Yeah, there's like a whole nother show to have and a whole nother conversation probably with you as a journalist about like what to do, how to cover bad ideas, and like the abject failure of our media to be able to grapple with that, and also their objectivity as journalism. Like, everything is not a curiosity. It's like, it's like abused women shouldn't leave their marriage. Bad idea, good idea? Who's to say? You decide. I mean, it's just silly. So yes, I do. I so appreciate, even though it's an opinion piece, like seeing your article in the coverage that's just like unapologetically like Dobson endorsed ideas that were like actively harmful. They harmed millions of children and probably wives and, untold other groups of marginalized people. So my just hats off to you as a journalist for writing that piece. But we saved some time to dig into some of our like online questions. So I'm going to throw some of those out there and just kind of see what you have to say. And just while we're talking about like failing media, there's a question kind of on that mainframe, which is like, how can, if we know media is not properly covering dangerous figures in the way that they need to be, like how can normal people bring these things to light? And how do you feel about like the need for people inside the church? Like, do we need insiders like you to be the ones to be able to sound alarms about figures like Dobson? Like, what do you see as available to us?
Yeah, it's hard because, if the media as an institution is perhaps not doing the job that it arguably should be, that does sort of put a burden, I think, on just everyday people. And what I would say, it can be frustrating as someone who grew up in the world to sort of feel like you're just rehashing kind of the most painful moments of your life over and over. And I do it because I do think that there's a real purpose to it, especially because Dobson's pitch was, your kids will love this. Well, they don't. But also, I got my start covering actually labor, not religion. I was trying to take a break from this. And one lesson that I kind of drew from that and is this notion of solidarity, but also organizing conversations. And that just means having really hard conversations with people who might not necessarily agree with you, but trying to figure out, okay, what do they think? What do they believe? Why do they believe it? And where can we find some kind of common ground? And by that, I don't mean kind of this, fetishization of like civility at all costs. But I think those conversations can be really important. I think social media can be a place to have them. I think there's some limited utility there, but in your real life, if somebody hasn't heard of James Dobson or they've just like seen something on social media and, oh, he sounded like an interesting person, maybe you can just have a conversation with them, take them out for lunch or coffee, figure out what's going on. And maybe they're just they just didn't know. I think that's often the case. But I think that's where I would start. And I know that that's, not easy, and it's not like this replacement, I think, for better journalism, but I think it's kind of the only place to start.
This is an interesting question, and I'm just curious if there's an answer. But do you know, like in Dobson's like heyday, do you know of any voices from within the church or within evangelicalism who called out his views, especially like his violent views?
I will say, and I don't want this to sound like I'm absolving Dobson, because I very much do not mean to do that. But at the time where Dobson was taking off and becoming really well known, there were other Christian parenting writers who were even worse. Michael and Debbie Pearl, the Ezzos, who did Growing Kids God's Way, who were more violent and than Dobson was. And so I've heard Dobson described as a moderating influence. I don't know what I think of that description, but it is true. He didn't go as far as other people were going. And so I think that meant that kind of helps us understand why maybe there weren't more voices calling him out in evangelicalism, because he didn't seem as bad as some of the alternatives. You can argue all day about whether that's true, but that, I think, is partly what's going on. As for the rest of Christianity, my husband grew up Catholic, had no idea this guy existed. Mainline Protestants, I do not really see as being on board with this. It was very much our bubble, and Dobson was actually really important to sort of this creation of almost a parallel, subculture.
Yeah.
So I don't. That's not a satisfactory answer, but that's how I think of it.
Yeah, that is something that so persists today. Like even thinking about the Doug Wilson comparison, it's just there are literally millions and millions of people in this subculture, but it's still so insular in so many ways from like mainstream culture and like mainstream attention. And that's the part that like I think Dobson was really good at. Well, growing so much in an under the radar way that when he made the move into the political arena, there already was so much power behind his movement. Question that is also interesting that I just don't know the answer to, that's just a straight up fact. Did Dobson have children?
Yes, he did. He had 2 children, Ryan and Danae. He wrote about them pretty frequently, along with his wife, Shirley. I don't really know much about what their lives are like at the moment. I know for a while, Ryan in particular, it kind of seemed like he was going to try to pick up the torch. He wrote a book about moral relativism, and then he kind of just disappeared from the internet a few years ago. And I have no special knowledge, but that is a mystery that I think about.
The second part of the question was, did any of them leave the fold? But I guess we don't know. But it's interesting that they're not carrying the torch of...
At least not that I know of. Yeah.
Interesting. What, if any, lessons can be learned from the impact Dobson had on Christianity? And like, how do you view him as sort of a cautionary tale for today? Similar individuals like gaining that type of influence in today's world.
When I think about Dobson's appeal, like what I think of as the source of that appeal, there's something almost predatory about it, at the very least exploitative in my view, because, and I think he was a true believer, to be clear, but I think he really appealed to parents who were susceptible in certain ways. He may have already had conservative views, but were really like, maybe they'd had traumatic childhoods, for example. My parents both had, less than exemplary childhoods. And I think, Dobson was telling me your kids could be different. They could be happier. They could be healthier. And, you're already a Christian at that point. So I think, you might be susceptible to that. And there are still people like that. You kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but the whole trad wife phenomenon on the internet, I think about that a lot. And because partly they're not evangelizing in the way that perhaps someone who's more overtly in the Christian right would, but they are marketing a particular, way of living, and that, there's this very conservative, I think, reactionary undertone to that. And I think that can be really appealing to people, although perhaps not as appealing as people like Dobson wanted to be. And I actually think that's really important, because Dobson would uphold this gender hierarchy, for example, as being natural. Well, it doesn't feel like that when you're living it. And I think that's really important. Like, it is made up. It's not real. These are like really harmful, negative beliefs. And you may hold it sincerely and believe that it's good for you, but it might not be good for you. And it certainly might not be good for your children.
That's so interesting. Especially to me, that really is exemplified in corporal punishment. It's so wild to me. I know people that were raised in evangelical homes, like really conservative Christian homes, like Dobson influenced, like your upbringing, that were taught and were vulnerable enough to begin their parenting journey as like fully bought into like corporal punishment, even like, infant correction type stuff. And just doing it just feels so unnatural and wrong. Like it just does, there's nothing about it that feels like you're doing something effective or right at all, let alone like effective. And so I think that is such, I don't know, both like hopeful and also like a testament to how powerful someone like Dobson can be in terms of like the following that they can garner to such a thing that feels so unnatural to well-meaning parents.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's easy to sort of dismiss parents who get into that as being maybe ignorant and ignorant maybe, but they're not stupid. I think everyone has the capacity to fall into a belief system that could be harmful for them or the people around them. I honestly believe that, and I think it's why atheism is important to me. It's certainly there's more to my worldview than atheism, but I do put a pretty high priority on, trying to think as clearly as I can. And I don't think that that's, a magic bullet. And it's getting more and more difficult, I think, as, kind of with social media and kind of the proliferation of misinformation and conspiracy theory there. And it's just getting harder and harder for people to, I think, just like have a normal life.
Yeah. The kind of last thing I just want to get your thoughts on is, I kind of think of Dobson's rise as having kind of riding a wave of like cultural backlash. He was obsessed with the sexual revolution and like backlash to, a permissivism in the culture that was new and rapid. And I see parallels to like the rise of today's conservatism, obviously, and Christian nationalism. And I'm just like wondering how you think about that in terms of the current moment, Dobson's legacy, and also like what's coming.
Yeah, it's like the ideas themselves are not necessarily new, but they are moving in perhaps new directions, or at the very least sort of ushering in kind of a new era in American politics that is even more radical than I think, when Dobson was really taking off and like advising Reagan in the 80s. And there's, Susan Flutie wrote Backlash in the 90s about kind of the backlash to second wave feminism. And I reread that recently and I've had that in mind because, there is this gender traditionalism on the rise and there is this backlash to LGBT rights, to women's rights and abortion rights. And I hope at least like this encourages people to not take those movements or those rights for granted, and to sort of understand, that, it kind of looked maybe like for a while that the Christian right was on the back foot, but it never really was. And, I don't think there's ever going to be this era in American history, at least, that it's not going to be a factor. It might not look the way it does now, but I think, we're always going to have, reactionaries around, and that's always going to appeal to people in some ways. And it's always going to be something to contend with. So, I'm optimistic, but I'm certainly not happy. I don't take progress for granted, and I hope that no one else does.
Sarah, thank you so much for coming on to our show this week. And can you remind viewers where they can follow your work, read what you write?
Yeah, so I'm a senior writer for New York Magazine on the Intelligencer vertical, and I cover politics and religion. And then I just put out my first book earlier this year called Disposable, and it's about American inequality in the early days of the pandemic. And that's out now from Avid Reader Press.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I can't wait to read it, and congratulations on the book.
That wraps up this week's episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist. You can also check out Free Thought Radio at ffrf.org/radio or wherever you get your podcasts.
And be sure to check out the latest episode of We Dissent. It is the only podcast hosted exclusively by women constitutional lawyers, including me, discussing state-church separation. Listen and subscribe to We Dissent wherever you get podcasts, or check us out online at we-dissent.org.
Finally, if you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check out our website at ffrf.org. If you're a member already, thank you. If not, please join us, and we will see you next time on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.